Alright, so I'm a little late to the party when it comes to reviewing this movie, but I have a lot to say about it, so with that out of the way, let's just get right into it. As a director, I generally like Zack Snyder. Now, I've only seen a few of his movies, and those primarily being the DCEU films that he's worked on, like Man of Steel, Batman v Superman, Batman v Superman The Ultimate Edition. All three of these I've reviewed on the channel, and I've even seen his Justice League movie. Not that one, that one. Thank you. Now, in spite of the fact that I've only seen a few Zack Snyder movies, I kind of have an idea of what kind of movies Zack Snyder likes to make. He likes to make dark movies to have a dark atmosphere or dark tone. He likes to make movies that are pretty grand in scale, like big set designs, big scope, big over-the-top bombastic action. And the plots, while not being super strong in terms of character development or story, they're generally enough to keep the viewer hooked. I'd probably say Zack Snyder's Justice League is an exception of that, but I digress. But the one thing I think I admired most about Zack Snyder, especially when it came to his DCEU movie, was his vision. What he was trying to do with his movie, where he was trying to take the characters, what his goal was in mind. And you could definitely see that in his DCEU film. He was trying to go somewhere, even if the process through which he was trying to take his movies and his characters pretty messy and bizarre. Now, the reason I'm sharing with you my views of Snyder is to tell you that I don't hate Zack Snyder as a director. I have a strange fondness for his work. In fact, I really should credit Zack Snyder for getting me into comic books. In fact, Man of Steel was the movie that sparked my interest in comic books, particularly DC, and it made me want to know what these characters were like. Who was Superman? Who was Batman? Who were all these characters? And I think another big reason why I have high respect for Zack Snyder as a director was because of his Justice League movies, that being Zack Snyder's Justice League, especially when you take into consideration the history behind what is now known as the Snyder Cut, or Zack Snyder's Justice League, whatever title you prefer. So if you want to know the short story of this whole Zack Snyder's Justice League saga, basically Zack Snyder was working on Justice League, the original movie, but then there was a tragedy in his family, so he had to step away from the Justice League movie. And Warner Brothers, in their infinite wisdom, decided to just carry on with filming Justice League, but they brought in Joss Whedon to make several changes, and major changes, so that what the finished product, which was the 2017 theatrical release of Justice League, was very different from what Zack Snyder envisioned. And then somewhere in there, it was rumored, I think, that Zack Snyder was working on his actual Justice League, either in secret, somewhere in there, but fans started clamoring for what Zack Snyder's vision of Justice League was, since Warner Brothers' vision was not his vision. So after much campaigning, Zack Snyder finally was able to release his Justice League movie, and it turns out it was better than the Warner Brothers product. Now, why am I telling you all this? And why am I going on such a long ramble when Justice League is not the movie I'm going to be talking about today? Well, the reason I'm bringing up Zack Snyder's Justice League is because, in my personal mind, I thought that if Zack Snyder was left to his own creative devices without any studio meddling, he could create a movie that was a masterpiece, that he actually had talent for making good movies. So, when I first saw the trailer for Rebel Moon, I thought, okay, Zack Snyder's had some time to cook. Maybe he can give us something that's really good. If Zack Snyder's Justice League was an amazing movie, perhaps maybe, just maybe, Zack Snyder could give us something truly amazing. It looks like Star Wars, but hey, Star Wars hasn't been delivering very much to fans on their front, so maybe Zack Snyder could give us something fresh and something that would be different from the products that Lucasfilm was releasing to us, since most of them were either mediocre or not well received. Then I actually watched Rebel Moon, and all my hopes for Zack Snyder as a director were dashed to pieces, because even after having complete control over his work, Snyder is still able to make a terrible movie, and a space-themed one at that. Let's start with the negatives this time instead of the positives, since those are the elements of the movies that are just sticking out the most. To start with, let's look at the plot of Rebel Moon briefly. Rebel Moon Part 1, A Child of Fire, tells the story of a woman named Cora who lives on a planet inhabited, as far as we know, by farmers, and she lives a peaceful life, raising crops and spending time with her fellow villagers. Then an evil tyrannical force known as the Mother World comes to the planet in a spaceship that looks like it was modeled after a basking shark, or a sperm world, pick your predator. Their leader, Admiral Atticus Noble comes to the village with an army to tell the villagers that they want a partnership with them, where the village will give the Motherworld army food in exchange for a large sum of money. The village chief turns down their offer, saying that they have poor soil and can't grow enough crops. But the admiral recognizes that he's bluffing and kills him and his wife, and then demands that the village turn over all of their food in 10 weeks' time. Korra, however, decides that it's better to fight against the Motherworld and takes out the army reserves left behind by the Motherworld on her planet and goes off in search of warriors who will come back to defend the village from this evil threat before time runs out. So the first problem with Rebel Moon that I want to go over is the exposition. There's a lot of it in this movie, and there's not enough showing to back it up. There's a lot of moments where stuff is just being told to the audience, or characters are just sitting together and they're just talking to each other about what their past, whether it's their own past lives or past events. In fact, the opening of the movie is just Anthony Hopkins narrating the backstory for the Rebel Moon universe, like the lore and stuff. But the presentation is so dull and uninteresting because the audience can't focus because what is being shown on screen is not consistent with what Anthony Hopkins is saying in the narration. Thus, it's preventing the audience from actually caring or understanding what the conflict of this universe is. Also, as I've said before, the exposition is given through characters' dialogue. Like there's a scene at the beginning after the Motherworld comes and threatens Korra's village. There's a scene where Korra starts packing her stuff because she thinks there's no hope for the village. And then her father figure comes into her house and then starts mentioning how he found Korra in a wrecked spaceship and he thought that she could mean trouble for the village. But just like in the opening, this incident is simply just told to us. It's not shown through flashbacks, nor does it show or explain why Korra's foster father values her or why he thinks she is valuable to the village. And it, again, prevents the audience from being able to care about the protagonist or just get sucked into the story. I'll talk about Korra later in the video. In regards to its plot, Rebel Moon feels very plot-focused and repetitive in its structure. If I were to summarize what actually happens in Rebel Moon, basically all the characters, all they do is travel from planet to planet looking for warriors who can defend the farming village from the bad guys. Each time they go to a new planet, they meet a new character. That character has to do something before they leave. And then everyone leaves the planet, rinse and repeat. The movie does not take the time to explore the planets. They don't explore how they work, what the people do on a daily basis on those planets, or why they are crucial to the Rebel Moon universe. The more I think about it, the more I realize that some criticisms against the movie are pretty valid. Like the criticism that the movie focuses on world building instead of its story and characters. And I think that's true. It kind of feels like a showcase of what worlds Snyder can make without actually incorporating them into the story. World building in movies is fine. In fact, it's necessary in order to flesh out the story. But you also need good character and story building to go along with that. And if you don't have that, then the movie is going to feel dull and lifeless. Speaking of characters, none of the characters in this movie really stand out as interesting or charismatic or anything that makes them stand out on the levels of those like Luke Skywalker or Batman. I know that sounds like a high bar to meet, and I'm not saying the movie should have tried to meet those standards, but what I am saying is that it should have had interesting characters that the audience could latch onto or relate to, and the movie just fails at that. Any characters that do stand out barely have any personality or only stick out because there's something of an arc there. It's a glimpse of it, but it's not really there. Or the character has something about him that or her that's slightly interesting. I'm not an expert on acting, so I'm not going to judge the quality of the performances given by the people playing the characters. But what I do know is that the main character, Korra, is pretty bland. She has no depth in her character and only wants to fight the Motherworld because of guilt, a motive that isn't really explored in this movie. She has a backstory, and that is presented to us in flashbacks, which I could say maybe is one of the more interesting parts of the movie, but it feels flat because there is nothing about Korra as a character in the present that the audience can latch on to. Now, while I did say that she wants to fight the Motherworld because she feels guilty and that it's not a motive that is explored in the movie, it's also not really a strong reason for her to go after the Motherworld, other than the fact that the plot needs her to do it in order to justify the movie's existence. As a result, it doesn't really help us, the audience, understand or connect to her as a character. So if she's not interesting in the present, how do you expect us, the audience, to understand her or care about her in the past? I wouldn't call Korra a Mary Sue because she does get beat up in battle sometimes, and she's not an unlikable jerk who is constantly praised by the other characters for being so good all the time. If you want to know my views on what a Mary Sue is, basically I think that a Mary Sue is not just somebody who's all powerful and doesn't lose all the time, but she is someone who is unlikable and a constant jerk all the time, and you're super powerful, so that basically you're just invincible. Think like Captain Marvel or Rey from Star Wars. They're both Mary Sues, they're both unlikable, and they both seem to just win at everything. And any challenges they do face are pretty minor. Korra here does get beat up, and she doesn't feel very strong in this movie. Maybe that's partly because she didn't have a lot of character development, but I digress. Korra just feels like some standard generic protagonist who wants to defeat the bad guys because the plot calls for it. Now, her partner, Gunner, is probably the only character in this movie that I can say has anything resembling a character arc. And even then, it's just flimsy at best since it only starts to show just as the movie is about to wrap up. Now, there are several characters in this movie who could have been interesting, like General Titus or the Blood Axe siblings. They could have been interesting characters because they were all involved in wars, and they seem to have an interesting backstory from the looks of their character designs, but they're never delved into, and we don't know why General Titus is the way he is or why the Blood Axe siblings are the way they are, because the movie never focuses on character development. It's just all about the world building and the setting and the pretty graphics and special effects and backgrounds and set designs and stuff like that. And some of the sets in this movie look cool. Some of the planets look cool, but there are some moments where you can tell that there's kind of a green screen in the background, like the big opening scene with Korra on the field planting grain or something, just finishing up her work. You could tell the background, especially by the lighting on Gunner's face, that planet in the background is fake. It is just looks like a green screen version of Jupiter smacked down on the movie, and it never looks convincing once. Well, now I'm just rambling here, so let's get back to the characters. There is a character I recall. Her name was Nemesis. She just joins the movie randomly. Like, there's a scene where all the characters go to this new planet, and the first thing we're introduced when it comes to the planet's inhabitants is all the characters are just in this elevator, and there's this lady. She's wearing this big silly hat, and we know nothing about her, and everyone just starts talking to her about, like, hey, we need warriors to help us join our resistance against the Motherworld. And then she just goes and fights this giant spider lady, and we know zero about this character. She just randomly shows up in the movie, she fights the spider lady, she wins, and then she joins the party. That's it. We don't know anything about her personality. We don't know anything why she's on this world. This is what I'm saying when it comes to Rebel Moon's problem with its characters, why it doesn't take the time to develop. Because characters just show up in the movie and they just join the group, even if they're talked about at length by the characters prior to them showing up, they contribute nothing to the plot at all. In terms of their characterizations, we know nothing about who they are as people or why they do what they do. They're just there, and you can't latch onto them because the movie doesn't give you any time to latch onto them. Now, I will say that not every character in this movie is uninteresting or boring. There are some characters I think who could have had potential in this movie. Let's take Anthony Hopkins' character, for example, Jimmy. Yeah, I know it's a weird name for a robot or droid or whatever he is. But in my personal opinion, now I might be in the minority when I say this, but I think Jimmy was the most interesting character in this entire movie. Anthony Hopkins' voice, I think, was pretty good. I think he did a fine job of it. It brought a sense of depth to the character, and it gave the impression that Jimmy is part of this old era. Like, he's described in the movie as having served the king, and we get a taste through dialogue of what he was like and what he did. And for a moment, it seemed like he was going to actually play a role in this movie. But again, the movie doesn't dwell too much on him. In fact, after the beginning of the movie, like after he helps rescue the girl from the Army Reserve, he just disappears from the movie until the ending where he's briefly seen wearing the antler horns. And by the way, you know in the trailer when they show him raising up his arms to the sky and saying, "It's a new age for the universe." I can't do Anthony Hopkins' impression, sorry. That never appears in the movie. So I don't know what Zack Snyder's doing with this character, but I'm interested in seeing what he does. But as for Rebel Moon Part 1, Child of Fire, this movie basically does nothing with this character except using him as a tool of exposition to deliver lore of the Rebel Moon universe. Also, there's another character who's this Motherworld soldier who looked like he had a sudden change of heart when Cora was trying to rescue her friend from the Army Reserves, and he looked like he would have a potential role in the movie, but he doesn't. The movie just leaves him behind and decides to just focus on Cora and Gunnar instead. And it's so disappointing because would have enjoyed this movie more, I think, if I saw this soldier and Jimmy in the movie. I think they could have had great roles in this film. Like, they could have done something in this movie that is significant. Also, before I forget, I would like to touch on the villains for a second. Particularly the one I think this movie focused on the most, Admiral Atticus Noble. He is not a good villain, in my opinion. The Motherworld as a whole just doesn't feel very threatening. They just feel like a bunch of bullies that just show up and say, hey, do this for us or we'll kill you. And that's it. They have a presence. They go around and just kill people who don't do what they say. But Atticus Noble as a character, I think, he was just not interesting. He felt like a discounted version of Cillian Murphy or a discounted version of General Veers, both of whom, whether real or fictional, were far more interesting than whatever he was. Atticus Noble is just not threatening. I don't even know what he wants. Like, he's just doing whatever the Motherworld wants him. He's just this generic bad guy that's there for the sake of the plot. You know who I think would have worked as a villain more is the character of Belisarius. Like, Cora mentions in her backstory that Belisarius plays a role, and like he was the one who brought her into the Motherworld army. And I think if we saw more of Belisarius in the movie, he could have been the bad guy. I was far more invested in who Belisarius was as a character, or why does he have an attachment to Cora? Why did he rescue her? What's his story? I think maybe the mysteriousness of this character and who he was, he could have been interesting in this movie. But again, like all the good things in this movie, he's not used at all. In fact, there's a ton of good things in this movie, and none of them are used or taken advantage of at all. They're just there, and then they're just left to die so that the rest of the movie can carry forward. Now let's talk about the action and the editing next, because I'm going to talk about both of these because I feel like both of these issues go hand in hand in this movie. Whenever there's an action scene, it always feels short and very uninteresting. Why? Because there's lots and lots of use of slow motion. There is so much slow motion in this movie, and it gets really old really fast. In fact, I guarantee that if you watch Rebel Moon for the first time, this movie will make you hate slow motion. Now, I'm not saying that slow motion is bad. Slow motion can be good, and there is a right time to use it. And if used correctly, it can sometimes evoke an emotion in the audience. In my opinion, the only times when slow motion can work really well is when an object like a weapon or a bullet or a heavy object narrowly misses a character, or when a character is about to do something that could potentially hurt them, like trying to jump a gap and it looks really far to jump and it doesn't look like they'll make it, or to emphasize the impact of something, say like how hard someone is punching you or how hard someone's getting struck with a bat. A slow motion can be effective in those areas and emphasize feelings like pain or evoke a thrill in the audience. In Rebel Moon, however, slow-mo is used so often that you start to feel numb to it almost immediately. Whenever someone fires a gun, slow-mo is used. If someone gets thrown to the ground, slow-mo. If someone gets thrown onto a table, slow-mo. If someone swings a weapon, slow-mo. Characters walk onto a new planet for the first time during the movie, slow-mo. It happens over and over again, and like I said, you will start to hate slow motion, which again, as I've said before, is not a bad thing. But Rebel Moon uses it so much and so often that it not only feels really tedious and dull, but also it nullifies moments that could use slow motion. Like there's moments in this movie where slow-mo could have been very effective, but they're drowned out and they lose their effectiveness because slow motion is used so often in Rebel Moon. And the action scenes are the moments where it's most prevalent. As I've said, the fighting, it just occurs so often. You start to see like somebody moves at normal speed, then it slows down, and then it kicks back to normal speed, and then it slows down. It just happens over and over again, and it's why I've said it makes the action scenes feel short. The only action scene that really works, in my opinion, is the final action scene, because slow-mo is used so little, or if it is used, it's used effectively and it feels like it could work. But because slow-mo has been used already in the film and to an absurd degree, you don't really care about what's happening on screen, and it just feels like dull, and it just makes you think, oh, here we go again, they're using the slow-mo again. Now, I don't want to be fully negative in this movie. Like I've said earlier, the movie does look good. Junkie XL, who did the score for Zack Snyder's Justice League, is back. So you hear the score and you think, you know what? this sounds great. It's a Zack Snyder movie. Of course, it's going to go over the top, loud synthesizers with choir in the background. And, when you listen to it, it's good. It's fun to hear. Gets you in the moment. But again, I feel like his music could have been done more effectively if this was a completely different movie. I like the scene at the end where Atticus Noble's getting healed in like that giant bubble and he gets transcended to where Belisarius is at the end. That was pretty cool. It's taking something that generally people think looks like it's going to copy off of Star Wars, like the Bacta tank, but actually it's used for other purposes other than healing or medical attention. So, I gotta give props to Zack Snyder on that. Is it the worst movie I've ever seen? Well, maybe the worst one I've seen in 2023. Absolutely. But not the worst one in my life. The worst movies I've ever seen, in my opinion, are not just bad movies in quality, but they're so bad they make you angry and upset. Rebel Moon is a bad movie, but it's fascinatingly bad. I say fascinating because this movie should have been easy to make. It didn't need to be on the same level as something like Star Wars or Dune. It should have just stayed focused on building a good story and character, and it failed to do that. It tried to be big. It tried to focus on developing its worlds and developing its plot through said world building. But as a result, I couldn't care about the characters. I couldn't care about the story. I couldn't care about the central conflict between the mother world and these so-called rebels. It's not that I didn't want to care. I wanted to, but the movie gave me no reason to care, and I was certainly disappointed by this movie, and even the good elements there were just never fleshed out, and I'm really not happy to say that this movie was bad, guys. As for a score, I'm going to give it a 3 out of 10. Anyway, guys, that's my review or rant for Rebel Moon Part 1, Child of Fire. I am interested in hearing what you guys have to say. I know this is not typical of the type of videos I make, because I usually make stuff about superheroes, but I've made videos on Zack Snyder movies before, so I thought I'd make one on Rebel Moon. So if you guys have seen Rebel Moon, please let me know what you think about this one. If you liked this video, if you enjoy hearing me talk about this movie or movies like this, you can drop a like or hit the subscribe button. I promise I'm going to come back with a better video, because next time on this channel, I will be reviewing every single movie in Phase 1 of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. That's right, baby. We're going through all the phases in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, starting with my next video. So you'll want to be subscribed and notified for that, folks. So stay tuned, everyone.